Have you ever ended a relationship, told yourself never again, and then somehow, a year later, found yourself in almost the exact same situation with a completely different person? Different face, different name, different story, but somehow the same dynamic, the same arguments, the same feeling of being unseen or smothered or abandoned or controlled, the same ending. If this sounds familiar, I want you to know something important right away. This isn't bad luck. It isn't a curse. And it isn't because there's something fundamentally broken about you. Carl Jung spent decades trying to understand exactly why this happens, and his answer is one of the most illuminating and honestly one of the most uncomfortable ideas in all of psychology. The pattern isn't coming from out there, it's coming from in here. The unconscious doesn't forget. Jung believed that the unconscious mind is not passive. It's not just a storage room where old memories collect dust. It's an active force that shapes your perceptions, your reactions, and yes, your attractions constantly, often without your awareness. From very early in life, your mind starts building templates, emotional blueprints of what relationships feel like, what love looks like, what safety means, what closeness is supposed to feel like. These templates are built from your earliest experiences, your family, your childhood home, the emotional climate you grew up in. And here's the part that changes everything. These templates don't stay in the past. They travel with you. They shape who you notice in a crowded room, who feels familiar, who feels exciting, and who feels safe, or interestingly, who feels excitingly unsafe. The person who felt like home to your nervous system as a child becomes the blueprint for what home feels like in every relationship after that. Even if that original home was complicated, even if it was painful, even if you consciously swore you'd never recreate it. Why familiar feels like love. This is the part most people find hard to hear. The reason you keep attracting the same type of person is often because that type feels familiar, and the unconscious mind confuses familiar with right. Think about it. The emotional texture of your earliest relationships, the way love felt when you were small and completely dependent on other people, that texture gets wired in. It becomes the baseline. And anything that matches that baseline feels, on some deep level, like it fits. This is why someone who grew up with an emotionally unavailable parent might find themselves repeatedly drawn to partners who are emotionally unavailable. Not because they enjoy the pain of it, but because the dynamic feels known. It feels like the emotional landscape they were born into. And the unconscious, remarkably, finds that landscape comfortable, even when the conscious mind is exhausted by it. It also works in reverse. Someone who grew up with a very enmeshed, smothering kind of love might find themselves pulling away from partners who offer genuine closeness, because that closeness feels unfamiliar, almost threatening. The safe-feeling relationship, to their unconscious, is actually the distant one. None of this is a character flaw. It's just the unconscious doing exactly what it was designed to do, seek out what it knows. The role of projection. Jung introduced a concept that's essential to understanding this pattern, projection, and it's simpler than it sounds. Projection is what happens when you take something that's inside you, a feeling, a quality, a fear, a desire, and experience it as if it's coming from someone else. You don't consciously decide to do this. It happens automatically beneath awareness. In relationships, projection is incredibly powerful. You might project your own need for control onto a partner, and experience them as controlling. You might project your own fear of abandonment onto someone and interpret neutral behavior as signs they're pulling away. You might project qualities onto someone early in a relationship, seeing them as more nurturing, more exciting, or more understanding than they actually are, because your unconscious is filling in the gaps with what it wants to find. Jung called the unconscious figure that gets projected onto a romantic partner the anima or animus. It's essentially your inner image of the ideal other, built from fragments of your history, your unlived qualities, and your deepest longings. And when you meet someone who triggers that projection, the feeling is electric. It feels like recognition, like you found something you've been looking for. The problem is you're not really seeing that person clearly. You're seeing the projection. And eventually, as the projection fades and the real person emerges, the relationship often feels like a disappointment, or worse, like a repetition of something painful and old. The pattern is trying to heal something. Here's where Jung's perspective becomes genuinely profound and also genuinely hopeful. He didn't believe these repeating patterns were meaningless. He believed they were the psyche's attempt to heal something unfinished. Every time you find yourself in a familiar, painful dynamic, part of what's happening is the unconscious trying to go back and resolve something it couldn't resolve the first time. It's putting you back in a situation that feels emotionally familiar, hoping that this time you'll respond differently. This time, you'll set the boundary you couldn't set then. This time, you'll ask for what you need. This time, you'll choose yourself. The pattern repeats not because you're doomed, but because the underlying wound hasn't been seen yet. The unconscious keeps recreating the conditions until you finally turn toward it and look. This reframe is everything. The repeating relationship isn't punishment. It's an invitation. The question is whether you're going to keep moving through it unconsciously, or whether you're finally going to slow down enough to understand what it's been trying to show you. What shadow work has to do with it. Jung's concept of the shadow is deeply connected to relationship patterns, in a way that's worth slowing down for. Remember, the shadow holds everything you've disowned about yourself. Qualities you were taught were unacceptable, needs you learned to hide, parts of yourself you pushed into the dark because they weren't welcome. Here's the thing about those disowned parts. They don't disappear. They get projected outward. And very often, the qualities that bother you most in a partner, the things that drive you absolutely crazy, are the very qualities that live in your own shadow. The person who can't stand a partner who is too needy might be someone who was taught that having needs was weakness, and who has spent years suppressing their own. The person who is endlessly frustrated by a partner's anger might be someone who has never allowed themselves to feel their own. This doesn't mean the other person's behavior is your fault or your imagination. It means that the intensity of your reaction is often a signal worth paying attention to. The stronger the charge, the more likely something personal is being touched. Shadow work in the context of relationships means asking, what is this person activating in me that's actually mine? What am I seeing in them that I haven't been willing to see in myself? Breaking the pattern. So how do you actually stop repeating this? Because knowing it intellectually and breaking the cycle are very different things. Jung's answer was, as always, consciousness. You cannot change a pattern you cannot see. The first step is simply bringing the pattern into awareness, which sounds easy and is actually one of the hardest things a person can do. because it requires giving up the very comfortable story that the problem is always out there, always the other person, always the circumstances. Start by looking at the relationships that have caused you the most pain, not to blame yourself, but to look for the common thread. Not what the other people had in common, but what your experience had in common. How did you feel? What did you do? What did you accept that you shouldn't have? What did you ask for too little of? The common thread in every relationship you've ever had is you. Not because you're the problem, but because you're the only variable you actually have access to. The second step is sitting with the discomfort of what you find, because what you'll likely find is something tender, a belief that you don't deserve better, a fear that if you ask for more, you'll be left, a familiar feeling of unworthiness that you've been unconsciously recreating instead of healing. That tenderness is not a weakness. It's the door. It's where the real work begins. Hash the relationship that changes everything. Jung believed that the relationship with the self, the ongoing, honest, sometimes painful process of individuation, was the foundation of every healthy relationship with another person. You cannot fully see another person until you start seeing yourself. You cannot stop projecting until you start owning what's yours. You cannot break a pattern until you understand what's driving it from underneath. This isn't about becoming perfect before you're allowed to love or be loved. It's about bringing more consciousness into the process, about choosing relationships from a slightly more awake place each time, instead of entirely from the autopilot of old wounds. The goal isn't to never feel attracted to someone familiar. It's to start noticing when familiar means healing versus when familiar means repeating. That distinction, subtle as it sounds, changes everything. Hash one thing to carry with you. Think about a relationship pattern you've noticed in your own life. Maybe a type of person you keep choosing. Maybe a dynamic that keeps reappearing. Maybe a feeling that keeps oming back no matter who you're with. Now, instead of asking, why do I keep meeting people like this? Try asking, what does this pattern feel like, and where have I felt this before? You don't need a full answer right now. Just sit with the question, because that question, honestly asked, is the beginning of the end of the pattern. I'll see you in the next one.